morning, and welcome to our webinar, Transparency, Public Access, and Trust, Keeping Local Government Open and Accessible Through Social Distancing. I'm Melissa Keene, a Program Manager with the Institute for Local Government, and I will be your moderator this morning. Many local governments across the state have issued shelter-in-place orders and closed their physical doors to the public. As such, local leaders are grappling with the implications of closed offices on open meetings, public records requests, and other operations. Today's webinar will provide an overview of new legal guidelines and useful tips for how to navigate and comply with the current requirements in an ever-changing environment while maintaining public access and trust. The quick overview of today's webinar. After this overview, I'm going to give you a little bit of information about ILG. We'll hear presentations from Mike Maurer with Best and Krieger and Randy Joel with the City of Temecula. We will have some time for Q&A after that, and then we will share our contact information with you for any follow-up that's needed. You are all in listen-only mode. Your lines have all been muted for the duration of the webinar, but at any point in time, you can ask us a question via writing in the questions box, which you should see on the right-hand panel of your webinar software. During that time we have held at the end, I will read your questions to the panelists, and we will get to as many as possible, and we can definitely follow up as needed with any questions we aren't able to get to. So a little bit about ILG. We are the nonprofit training and education affiliate of the League of California Cities, the California State Association of Counties, and the California Special Districts Association. We provide practical and easy-to-use resources so agencies can effectively implement policies on the ground. We provide education and training, technical assistance, capacity building, and convening services to local governments statewide on a variety of issue areas. Our civics education and workforce program helps create that pipeline to public service. We facilitate municipal school partnerships and share information about careers in public service. Our public engagement program helps local governments authentically and consistently engage with their communities on a variety of topics and issues. Our Sustainable Communities program covers topics ranging from housing and land use to energy efficiency and greenhouse gas reduction. And our Leadership and Governance program, of which this webinar is part of, provides training and resources on state mandated requirements, such as the AB 1234 and harassment prevention trainings, as well as helping agencies operate more effectively, develop leadership skills, and ensure public trust. Just a few resources we have available to you all for free. We have created a COVID webpage that has local government resources, state and national resources, state executive orders, tools and training opportunities, and is highlighting a number of local government responses of all the great things that you all are doing across the state to shift and react to this emerging crisis. We have a number of resources on ethics. I mentioned the training opportunities, but we also have a number of publications on things like the Brown Act, the Political Reform Act, Form 700 filing, and more. And on the leadership side, we also have a number of resources around effective counsel, decision-making, responsibilities and powers, and more, and we do training on those topics as well. So a quick overview of why we're here today. This is a snapshot of what we were looking at a couple days ago. As of the 30th, we had almost 7,000 positive cases in the state of California, and you can see a breakdown there based on ages statewide. Obviously, we all know that there was a stay-at-home except for essential needs order issued on March 20th. So we're all working remotely and adapting as needed. If you're looking for some additional, more localized resources, our affiliates, the League and CSAC, have both created web pages that are interactive maps of emergency declarations, stay-at-home orders, and other information. So if you're looking for information based on your locality, I would encourage you to look at those and see what's happening in your part of the state. So as I mentioned, today's presenters are Randy Joel and Mike Maurer. Randy brings over 20 years of experience in leadership in municipal government. She has served cities and special districts throughout the state of California in various capacities, including as a law clerk in a municipal law firm, a legal analyst, a legislative affairs director, and a city clerk. She specializes in legislative platforms, elections, and community engagement. She currently serves as the legislative director and city clerk for the City of Temecula, legislative director for the California City Clerks Association, and a board member for the League of California Cities and ILG. Mike practices municipal law as an attorney at Best and Krieger in addition to advising cities and special districts on the legalities of their day-to-day operations. Mike provides exceptional guidance to public agencies in the areas of land use, public infrastructure and construction, and open government and ethics laws. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike to get us started with the legal overview, and then Randy is going to provide a little bit more context about the practical application of how all of this is working in local governments across the state. So, Mike?
Thank you, Melissa. All right, so as Melissa mentioned, I'm going to give a little overview about the legal background of what we're doing here. And we're really going to focus on, what I think of as the core government function. So the Brown Act, the Public Records Act, and the conflict of interest laws. So before we get into that specifically, I just want to note that we're all familiar with the stay-at-home orders that have been issued. And we all know that local government's considered an essential service under those orders. So many of you are still at work, either at City Hall without the public there, or you're working from home, but the work that we're doing as government officials continues. So it's continuing in a different way than I think any of us have ever dealt with. It's certainly an unprecedented situation. But what I kind of want to keep in mind as an overview as we go through this is that even though the way we operate changed, even though our person-to-person interactions are paused for the time being, the values that we have as public officials remain the same. So I think what's really important as we go through this is to keep in mind that in this period, we still want to be as transparent as possible. The ethical rules still apply. There's still a need to be responsive to the public, and there's still an opportunity for public involvement and public engagement. So I consider those sort of guiding values that as we look at how things change from a legal and practical landscape, that keeping those values in mind is really key and really guides how we're going to get through this particular situation. Next slide. All right, so as I mentioned, the key areas to consider that we're going to go over are public meetings, public records, conflict of interest laws, and then I'm just going to touch on general government services slightly. So we can go to the next one.
And Mike, you're a little muffled. Can you speak closer into your microphone, please?
Yeah, I will. Is this better?
Yeah, that sounds better. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so we're going to start out with the Brown Act, and this has been the big one lately because when the COVID-19 issues first struck, the question was, does the Brown Act still apply? We're trying to reduce gatherings, we're trying to encourage social distancing, but we have this rule under the Brown Act that requires public meetings and requires public access. And if you're familiar with the existing teleconference rule under the Brown Act, even though the Brown Act allows for teleconferencing, that rule actually requires that each teleconference location be posted and made accessible to the public, and that a quorum of the board be within the jurisdiction. That's created lots of challenges through the years, through my career. I've had council members calling in from hotels in different continents at 4 in the morning, and we have to post their hotel and provide public access to it. So I think we're all familiar with how challenging that teleconference rule is. So the governor initially suspended the teleconference rule, but said each agency has to provide one physical location. So we don't have to post the teleconference locations, we don't have to give notice of it, but there still has to be a physical location. On March 17th, the governor issued a new executive order replacing the first one. And this new executive order, as I think we're all familiar with now, says that a city or other public agency can hold their public meetings completely by teleconference. So no longer have to have a physical location. So during this time period, while we're in this period of emergency, we can now host public meetings, Brown Act meetings, without having a physical location. I will clarify the executive order doesn't prohibit a physical location. Technically, you still can have one, but what it does is it enables a meeting to be 100% by teleconference or other electronic means. So when we say teleconference or other electronic means, it's very broad. The governor didn't specify how it has to be done. So it could be through a teleconference line, it could be through webinar software, it could be through software similar to Zoom. It just has to be, it could be any of those. So there isn't specifics as to how you have to hold the meeting. There are 4 requirements that you have to follow. So the first and the biggest one is the public has to be able to observe and address the meeting. So observe the meeting basically means, and when I'm saying what these mean, keep in mind, we don't have precedent here. We don't have a history of interpreting this order. We're really just going off the language of the order and doing the best that we can to figure out what it means. So observe the meeting, I'm taking that to mean that there's some sort of live access to watch the meeting on TV, listen to the meeting on a teleconference line, some sort of completely public access way to hear the meeting. Address the meeting in the most basic sense means we still have to enable public comments. So however you're going to do that, whether it's through email, through a teleconference line, however you do that, you still have to provide an opportunity for the public to, quote, address the meeting. So that's really the basic requirement is in order for us to have teleconference meetings, the public still has to be able to observe and address the meetings. 3 other requirements. One is that notice still has to be timely posted. So we're all used to posting 72 hours ahead for a regular meeting, 24 hours ahead for a special meeting. That hasn't changed. We still have to post the notice within those time frames. One difference about what's on the notice. Under the executive order, the notice has to say how the public can observe and address the meeting. So you need to give notice as to the way in which the public can listen in. And then however you're enabling public comments, that needs to be set forth in the notice. So this seems somewhat obvious, right? That if we're doing something different, we're going to have to explain it. But it is a requirement set out in the order that the notice has to be clear as to how the public can attend the meeting and can address the council or board. And then last is the agency has to still provide reasonable accommodations. And you have to have some way to swiftly hear requests for accommodations and respond to them. This really isn't a different rule that both the ADA and the Brown Act require reasonable accommodations already. This isn't a change in the rule. It's not something new that's required. But taking into account that you're providing access to meetings in a completely different way, that may provide a need to think through how you're providing access to everyone. When we're talking about reasonable accommodations, it's usually referring to someone who's hearing or vision impaired. There isn't a specific way to make reasonable accommodations. It's something that can be considered on a case-by-case basis. It's something that, frankly, through some of these materials may even be easier to do, but you will want to think it through. You may want to talk with your IT department, depending on what type of teleconference or electronic tools you're using, and determine whether it can meet the needs of individuals who have hearing-related disabilities, or whether you'd have to respond on a case-by-case basis for other accommodations as they come in. We do have a poll on the side. This is partly just for my own curiosity, but since we have so many people on this webinar, we wanted to see how your agency is enabling public comments, just so we can get an idea of what agencies are really looking at out there. All right, next slide.
So you all should see a polling question on your screen now. So please go ahead and answer that, and then I will share the results once we have a number of people respond. And Mike, your mic is still sounding a little muffled. I'm not sure if there's anything else you can do, but just wanted to give you a heads up.
Okay. All right. I'm sorry, Melissa, are the slides back up on the screen?
I still have the poll open for just another minute. We've got about 60% of people who have voted, so I was just going to give it a few more seconds and then share those results. Okay, let me go ahead and close this and share. So you all should be able to see the results there. It looks like the majority of you are providing email comments. A lot of you are providing teleconference lines, and then a few are providing direct calls to your clerk, webinar comments, or a physical location for comments as well.
Great. So it really is pretty overwhelming that email comments are the way agencies are meeting this new Brown Act requirement. Okay, so next slide. All right, so some other considerations with Brown Act meetings. What's the one rule when you're doing teleconference meetings? You have to take roll call votes. So there isn't any way around that. Roll call vote means you call each member of the council or board, and they give the vote when they're called. You can't say, all in favor say aye. You have to say, Councilman number one, how do you vote? So that is actually a Brown Act requirement. It's not just a practical rule. It is a requirement that you have to take roll call votes. That rule is still in place. Another thing to consider is when you're doing electronic meetings, your meeting decorum and procedures really are highlighted. It's obviously, even as we're doing this and you hear some of the challenges with presenting a webinar from home, it's even more challenging when you have 5 different people plus staff on the line, each trying to talk at once. So really being strict with your meeting decorum, and Randy will talk a little bit more about this later, but planning that out, thinking about it ahead of time and sticking with those procedures really helps make a good meeting when you have to teleconference. And finally, there's one other Brown Act note that I didn't mention, which is in Executive Order N3520, the governor actually clarified that a majority of a board or council can receive an update from federal, state, or local officials about the emergency and ask questions about that update without it becoming a Brown Act meeting. It's very limited. It says the board still cannot discuss or take action. So if, say they're getting an update from the police chief, a city council still can't, give any sort of direction or attempt to make policy, but they can receive that update and ask for clarification. All right, next slide. All right, so the Public Records Act, just for some background, the California Emergency Services Act gives the governor the ability to suspend state law during a state of emergency. That's where his authority to suspend provisions of the Brown Act has come from. But at least to date, he hasn't suspended any portion of the Public Records Act. So this means responses are still due within 10 days. The rules for extension still apply, which there isn't an extension for the response that's directly related to emergencies or this type of situation. But keep in mind that production is within a reasonable time. So even though responses are due within 10 days, production isn't necessarily due within 10 days. It can be reasonable under the circumstances. We can go to the next slide. And then lastly, under conflicts of interest, again, the ethics rules haven't been suspended at all. The ethics rules still apply. The Form 700 filing deadline's been extended from April 1st to June 1st. But one ethical question that's come up, how do you declare a conflict in a telephonic or electronic meeting? We're all familiar with there's a conflict, you announce the conflict, you walk out of the room, you wait till it's over. We've reached out to the FPPC, asked for some informal advice, and they've said ideally what you would want to do is get off the line if you're on a conference call line. Just get off the line during that period, announce the conflict as you would, get off the line, and then get back on the line when the item's over. If that's not feasible, it's still okay to just simply mute your line, not participate at all, and make clear that you're not participating because of a conflict. So next slide. And just to wrap up my portion on this, we've had a lot of questions about, in general, there are a lot of operational things that public agencies do that's person to person, and more items than we can talk about in this 1-hour webinar. So I've tried to paint a picture with a broad brush. How do we address these challenges that come up right now? And I think it's important to keep in mind that what we're dealing with is unprecedented. There isn't a playbook for how we handle this. There isn't a history of case law that we can relate to. We really have to figure it out as we go along and do our best. So how do we do that? I think there are two things that are really important. One is whatever changes you're making, do it in good faith. I think of good faith as, are we serving the public interest? If there's a request for a public record and you don't have access to the record because of closures of facilities, responding as best you can and explaining that to the requester is at least showing good faith. If you get a request and you say, well, I've got an excuse not to have to respond to this, that's not showing good faith. So I think just keeping in mind that good faith approach is really the best way. And then having a paper trail to document it. If you're not able to, say, get a public record because it's not accessible right now, put that in writing and make sure you explain it and show what you're doing to respond as best as you can to that request. So explain when you'll be following up, what records you can make available, things like that, to be able to have a history that you're showing good faith and acting in good faith. And then lastly, there are things that can be done electronically rather than in person. I think we're all thinking through this right now. I'll just note real quickly that California has adopted the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act. This act basically says that an electronic record and an electronic signature carry equal legal weight as a wet signature. There's more nuance to that. The parties generally have to agree to it, but it is, we're used to doing things face to face and in writing, but we do have some flexibility to sign things, prepare documents electronically. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Randy to discuss some of the practical issues.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, everyone. Melissa, can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound clear. Thank you very much.
Awesome, thank you. Well, I want to start by saying to everyone that is a participant in this particular webinar, thank you to all of you. I know you guys are doing double duty right now, many of you, as am I, with continuing to deliver some semblance of regular services and then still serving as disaster workers, EOC workers. I want to start by just thanking you as public servants and acknowledging that your efforts are greatly appreciated. So on behalf of your communities as well, thank you very much. So for this portion of the webinar, we kind of wanted to focus on the practical elements at the street level, what implementation is actually looking like. So with respect to the Brown Act, the agenda language that Mike referenced, that for us here in Temecula, and I'm noticing some of the agendas throughout the state as well, that is a little bit at the forefront. So for example, on my particular agenda, we always have a box at the very top of the agenda that addresses ADA requirements. So we always have a box that provides a standard statement that says, hey, if you need special assistance to participate in our meetings, please let us know. What we have done is we have provided a direct telephone number because we can't provide necessarily language for every type of ADA accessibility that might be requested, but what we can do is we can provide standard language to reach us so that we can then work through our method to provide that particular special assistance. City Hall is closed. So that number, it's very important if you're going to provide any telephone numbers on your agenda, that those numbers are forwarded to actually yourself, city clerk, or just somebody on the other end of that line, so that the message doesn't sit in a voicemail box someplace. Typically, we ask, it's a standard sentence that said notification 48 hours prior is helpful, but we don't demand it. The minute we hear or receive an accessibility request, we go ahead and address it at that time, even if it happens to be on the day of the meeting. We have started our agenda with the very statement in bold that says important notice regarding this council meeting. Under that is where we have went ahead before the regular agenda even starts. That is the first thing on page 1, and that is the statement that Mike was referring to earlier. We have mentioned that this particular meeting is being conducted utilizing teleconferencing and electronic means in accordance with California Executive Order numbers in response to the pandemic. We have noted that the live stream can be viewed online or on Channel 3. Online, folks can actually view it just through regular live stream YouTube methodology, or they can view it through webinar methodology. All of those details are provided on that particular link for us, which is temeculaca.gov/TV. I'm going to roll through this information rather quickly, but after this particular webinar, if anybody has any questions that we're not able to get to, you can always send me an email, and I'm happy to share whatever that you guys hear, copies of the agenda, or whatever you guys need. We've also noted under there how members of the public can submit their comments, and the methodology by which we will be receiving, which as of right now, we are receiving emailed comments. We have also told the public that when those emails are submitted, what will happen to those emails. So how we will read them into the record, for what length of time we will read them. So we have a little notice saying that whatever emails are submitted as a part of public comments, we will read those public comments into the records, and that reading will not exceed up to 3 minutes, which is consistent with the time limit that we have for speakers at a council meeting. All of that information is provided in that notice so that the public knows upfront how to submit comments and how those comments will be treated and turned into a part of the record. So that's pretty much the gist of with respect to the noticing and the agenda language. I did want to make a comment with respect to posting our agendas and our noticing that way. We did encounter some difficulty with respect to, we have 3 locations where we post at. So in our breezeway down at City Hall, at the Chamber of Commerce, and at our library. The library and Chamber of Commerce are now officially closed to the public. So it has been raining, and so we decided against the posting on the front doors of those locations. And everything that we've done has been lockstep in consult with our fabulous city attorney, Peter Thorson at Richards, Watson, Gershon. So we decided on our proof of posting to include language that says, under the declaration of local emergency, posting was attempted at the following locations, and it was not available because those locations are closed to the public. So as Mike indicated earlier, we are documenting everything that we're not able to do so that we can show a good faith effort. With respect to conducting the meeting, obviously social distancing is at the forefront. So to the extent possible, some of the methods that we initially were going to utilize when City Hall was still open was taping off every other chair or every 2 chairs in the public gallery. We were going to take the exec team off of the dais so that we could spread the council members out on the dais further. But when we closed the City Hall to the public, we actually went to going ahead and having only the mayor, the city manager, and myself in the council chamber. So social distancing obviously was not a problem at the dais. And the other 4 council members were participating via webinar, as was the exec team and members of the public in a viewing capacity. I do want to make a small little note about that. And I am not by any means advertising, I completely apologize, advertising to any sort of product. We opted to use Zoom webinar. I have heard of some instances where perhaps the free subscription doesn't work out quite as well as the Zoom webinar paid subscription did. I'm sure there's other technology services that can provide similar services as well. But what Zoom webinar allowed us to do was for the city to actually control the webinar as the host, so that we could go ahead and mute members of the public. And if a council member was having problems or difficulties, or any other participant was having problems or difficulties, we had the ability to mute them on our end, and so that the meeting could continue without interruption or minimal interruption. So that's kind of how we've addressed social distancing. We did go ahead and distribute to our elected officials and everybody that had the potential to be on screen. It kind of looked like a Brady Bunch screen. Just some good tips about when you are participating in these webinars, these Zoom calls, the type of location you want to be in a home office, the lighting, the surrounding environment, the background noises, things like that. And there's plenty of those kinds of tips on Google, so you can always go ahead and distribute that for your elected officials and those that are participating in a panelist capacity as well. I already kind of addressed technology. Like I said, we pretty much are relying on a virtual environment and very limited physical presence. With respect to public comments, I addressed this a little bit earlier when I was going over the agenda language. We are receiving public comments via email, so that 80% doesn't necessarily surprise me, even though we have the capacity as webinar hosts to go ahead and control that particular piece, and when we can mute and not mute public comments. The challenge with us on why we decided to go ahead and stick to this route for right now, although we are looking into, the city of Temecula utilizes Granicus, so we are doing some research when we have time into potentially e-comments or other methods that we can allow for public participation, especially when it comes to like our commission meetings when there's not a lot of public comments, or like our notice subcommittee meetings with council members, you know, those types where there's not a ton of public comments. If there's an ability to go ahead and just allow public comments through the webinar feature. But right now we decided to pretty much do emails because it was a way that we could ensure that everybody comments became a part of the record and were read into the record utilizing the same methodology. We didn't want to necessarily have to deal with if somebody was in the middle of a public comment and through no error got dropped off or any of these kinds of things that you know, we just didn't want to deal with that particular challenge at this time. This is what Mike was talking about with respect to planning your council meetings and roll call votes and so on and so forth. Scripting. I'm a firm believer in scripting. I've never believed in scripting as much as I do now because we are in a virtual setting. And so what we do is, for anybody that has a speaking part, they get a copy of the mayor's script. The mayor's script actually allows the mayor to see and pause where appropriate for actual a verbal statement or a roll call. I'll give you the example. On our agenda, we have City Council, a section for City Council reports, City Council comments. So on the mayor's script, under that particular section, it actually has a statement that says, okay, we are to the City Council portion of the agenda. Given that we are in a virtual setting, I will go ahead and call upon my colleagues one at a time to go ahead and provide City Council comments. And then he goes to Mayor Pro Tem, Councilmember so-and-so, Councilmember so-and-so. And it's just a way to go ahead and create a smooth flow of the meeting. And the mayor is grateful, the council members are grateful, the staff is grateful, because it just allows for that continuity and continuation of the meeting without having people talk over each other. The same is true for a roll call. The same is true for a business item or a public hearing item. In the mayor's script, when after he has called for the staff report, he then goes ahead and calls for questions of his colleagues, and again says, because we're in a virtual setting, Councilmember so-and-so, what do you have any comments? Councilmember so-and-so, comments, questions, whatever. And then what that allows for, like, again, is uninterrupted thoughts from the council members one at a time. For the motion in his script, he does have something that says, because we are in this virtual setting, we need to go ahead and provide a roll call vote. Madam City Clerk, will you please take the roll call vote? And then I go ahead and call individual names. So the scripting is tremendously helpful at this time for everyone involved, and frankly the public as well, because it allows them to know what is happening on an ongoing basis in the meeting, and helps to keep decorum. Finally, outreach. Outreach is very important. We started pushing out on social media several weeks ago how we were going to be conducting our meetings in this virtual environment, including how the public could submit comments for upcoming meetings, so that it wasn't just a surprise when somebody saw the agenda. They had already seen it on Facebook, or they had already seen it on Instagram, or they had already seen it on our Channel 3 slides about how the city is here providing virtual services and providing a virtual council meeting. And while the methodology may be different, the participation levels remain the same, and we encourage the public to continue to remain a part of the public discussion. Next slide, please. So the Public Records Act, at the street level, what's happened here is obviously there is a difference between physical and electronic receipt of requests. The City Hall is literally closed. So we, at this time, are not receiving folks that are walking in and asking to either review documents and or submit a PRA. We are on our website, specifically under the City Clerk's page. It does say exactly how you can submit public records requests and review public records requests online. With respect to the inspection of records, anywhere where we can produce electronic records via email and or access to our web QA portal, we are absolutely doing that. So to some degree, our PRAs have actually not been impacted to the level that we thought they were going to be, because 90% of our PRA function is already handled electronically. With respect to production itself, We are still automatically acknowledging receipt when we receive something through the WebQA portal. If it comes in, we have a default setting where it automatically says, hey, we thank you for your request. This acknowledges receipt, and then we have a staff person that is working virtually from home that is going ahead and processing those. If a request comes in via email, same thing, we are acknowledging receipt of that immediately. And then we are going ahead and working with our departments, obviously remotely, to see if there are documents that either we can go ahead and produce within the 10 days, or if we can't, what the reasoning is. And then we go ahead and provide that in our response, as Mike had alluded to earlier. Again, we are heavily relying on technology at this time. Outreach is the same as well. On the outreach side of the house, we have updated our web page, our web site to also include some drop downs on the main page of our website on with respect to how people can go ahead and submit public records, and frankly review records online, which was kind of our long-term effort to reduce the number of PRAs overall, even before this pandemic hit. To the extent possible, all of our permanent records are already online as a part of our Laserfish repository that our community can access at any time. Next slide, please. All right, so as Mike mentioned, we got a reprieve from the FPPC. We had reached out. Thank you to those who have been submitting emails to me and the league folks for the last 2 weeks on your suggestions on the different things that we could seek delay and or waivers on. The Form 700 was one of those things. Obviously, we have commissioners, council members, designated employees who, for the most part, do have electronic access and can submit electronically. But we do, in my case, I do have a couple of commissioners that aren't as tech savvy, and they still like to give me the paper form, which I go ahead and input electronically, manually, just upload a PDF. So we did not want our elderly commissioners leaving their home to come and submit a Form 700 to me. So so that is something that we greatly appreciate the FPPC's reprieve on till June 1st. I will tell you that for me internally, what I have encouraged my filers to do is to go ahead and submit by April 1st if they can, so they can just cross this off their list, and I can go ahead and cross this off the list. But if they can't, that they do not have to worry about taking any risks from a public health perspective to go ahead and manually submit or any of those things. And that was consistent with what the FPPC statement was as well, that while they encourage people to file by the April 1st deadline or at the earliest convenience, they are extending till June 1st. I've already gotten some inquiries regarding campaign disclosure forms. So we do not have specific advice yet from them on the delay or waiver of campaign disclosure forms. I would say that obviously if you are having some challenges with that, as the FPPC always encourages, document, document, document. And I think Mike referenced that as well, is just any and all reasonable efforts that we can show to get compliance, and any and all reasonable efforts that the filer can show to go ahead and make the filing on time would be great. And if there are exceptions to that, let's just document, and reasonable efforts given the pandemic, I'm guessing will be given some consideration. And finally, some miscellaneous. I left this under the Political Reform Act, but it's not really just specific to the Political Reform Act. Some of you may have seen, the League of California Cities did submit a letter to the governor's office indicating a variety of services that have been that will be impacted by the closure of local government, city halls and county buildings, things that had to do with housing deadlines and transportation deadlines, and we submitted information regarding Public Records Act requests and districting and all kinds of things. So I do want you guys to know that we are actively in conversations through the league. They are in conversations with the governor's office, depending upon how long this effort, how long this pandemic goes. I imagine that effort will continue. And if you have any suggestions on anything that cannot be done electronically right now and will impact deadlines and timelines, please feel free to send me an email and I will make sure that it gets over to the league. They're keeping, like I said, a list of items and we can keep adding to that particular list. So with that, again, thank you for your services in this challenging time. I know your communities appreciate your effort. Melissa, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you both for providing this overview and these tips to hopefully help the cities and counties and districts on the line navigate this crisis. As I mentioned at the outset of the webinar, we are accepting questions via the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. We've already received a number of comments and we only have about 10 minutes. So we're going to get to as many as possible, but also please feel free to continue to write in those questions and we can follow up as needed. Before we jump into the questions, Randy, we have received a couple of requests to see your agenda cover page. So if you can send that to me, I'm happy to share that with the attendees in the follow-up email with the recording and the slide deck and all of that. So if you wouldn't mind sharing that, it sounds like they're would be much appreciated by the attendees on the line.
Sounds good. I'll share it with you.
Perfect. Okay, so let's jump into the questions and see how many of these we can get to. So the first question we have is about closed sessions. So how, do you have any tips on how to conduct electronic closed sessions?
And Melissa, I'll jump in on this one. The one thing I'll say about closed session is if you're having a closed session right now, use some other electronic means than what you're doing for the open session. Remember, you still have to open it in open session. You still have to announce publicly whether any action was taken. But what I would do is have a separate conference call line or something for closed session that's only given to the council members and the staff members who have to be in there. That way you're ensuring that there aren't any members of the public or anyone else listening in on your closed session that you didn't anticipate being there.
Perfect, thank you. And related to that, there's a question about if you can discuss COVID-19 in closed session.
I'll jump on that one as well. The short answer is no. There may be closed session exceptions that apply to particular circumstances. There is an exception for security issues related to public facilities. There's also an exception for labor negotiators that may apply if you have labor negotiations related to this situation. But from a broad-based perspective, there's not. And I would emphasize that in this situation, transparency is obviously key, as we've mentioned a few times. So most of your discussions related to this are going to be an open session.
Great, thank you. I think this one is to potentially both of you. There's a question about what can you do if there's a disruption. I'm assuming this is either related to technology and or general meeting disruptions that you may deal with in an in-person meeting. Any tips on how to handle those?
So I can answer from a technology disruption standpoint. I think if that is why we have, together with our information technology group, kind of pre-gamed what disruptions could occur. So we actually did a test meeting before our actual meeting, and we went through some of what if a council member has technical difficulty? What if an elected official drops off? What if a presenter drops off? What if a public comment is choppy and drops off. And that's kind of how we came up with, let's go ahead and keep maximum control of the technology piece of it with the city and our IT group who runs the back end of the meeting, so that they can address the disruption as quickly as possible, and then the mayor can continue moving the meeting on. And when that happens, again, we have a little note on the mayor's script as well, as if any disruptions occur, as soon as the disruption occurs, let's go ahead and say, you know, it appears that we're having a little disruption, and we will try to get council member X back on the line. Let's go ahead and move on to council member so-and-so. So as long as you can keep the flow going, I think you'll be fine.
And the one thing I'll add is, if the Brown Act does allow for clearing the room in the event of a disruption, if a member of the public's causing a disruption. That's section 54957.9. So effectively, something similar may happen here. It may be worthwhile to think of what your plan B is if you don't have control the way that Randy's saying. When you clear the room, at the very least, you have to let the press back in. So you may want to have your press contacts if you have a beat reporter that's at your meeting. And you may just want to have a plan for what that is. You know, ideally, that you never want that to happen. But preparation, as Randy said, I think is key here.
Great, thank you both. We have a number of questions around public comments. So I'm going to try to combine a couple of these and see if we can address them. So it sounds like some folks are having some issues with public comments, and they're wondering if they can limit comments to email submissions, or if they have to provide a live verbal arena for the public to comment on agenda items as well.
So I'll address it. That's a tough question because, like I said, we don't have a precedent here. So all we have to go off of is what's stated in the governor's executive order, which says you have to give the public the ability to observe and address the meeting telephonically or by some other electronic means. So, you know, the best I could say is if you're allowing email comments, you know, that is some other electronic means. So at the very least, you're meeting that. But I think what you need to do is think about what works for your community and how your community handles meetings. I think email comments may work for some communities and may not work as well for others. So I think it's something you want to think about, you know, what's going to serve your community. Do it in conjunction with your city attorney or agency counsel and your mayor or board president, and figure out what the best approach is for your agency. But at a basic level, you have to provide some sort of electronic means for comment. So the governor's order certainly doesn't exclude email only as an option.
Great, thank you. We've received a few comments and questions on the roll call vote piece. There's one question asking if you can take one roll call vote for the entire consent calendar, or if you have to take each item separately, or if there's any other best practices you all have to share on roll call votes.
So I can jump in there. We actually, the mayor actually does say under the consent calendar that all consent calendar items will be taken as one roll call vote, unless we have anyone who would like to go ahead and pull an item. So at this time, he goes ahead and he reads all of the titles, and unless we have a member of the public via email who has provided comments on a consent calendar item, or a council member who would like to pull, we are still doing one roll call vote and for the entire consent calendar, and that's consistent with what our city attorney has advised.
Okay, thank you.
One tip I'll add. One tip I'll add for roll call votes, along with what Randy mentioned about scripting, you might want to script out which, and this is agency by agency, but it may make sense to script out the order of the roll call. That way there aren't disputes among the council or board as to who's called first and last, et cetera. So it may help to just have that set out ahead of time. That way you can avoid that particular discussion. Back to you, Melissa.
Thank you. I think we've got time for maybe one more question so we can still get to sharing our contact information and all of that and getting you guys out on time. Jumping back to public comment questions, there's a few questions around email comments and the requirements of them being read into, being read aloud at the public meeting. Is that a requirement? How would you all suggest they address that?
So for our city and in consultation with our city attorneys, we have absolutely decided that the public comment should be read into the record because the individuals are not there physically to go ahead and provide their public input, that at a minimum, we stand in their place to include their comments from which traditionally would have been given at the podium into the record. That they are limited to 3 minutes. So if they have sent me a dissertation, I wouldn't necessarily read the whole thing. They have up to 3 minutes. And even if it's a challenging public comment that criticizes what the city is doing, if it would have been permissible at the podium, we're going to go ahead and ensure that it is permissible to be read into the record. Obviously, if it's got obscenity or something, we'd have to consult with the city attorney to exclude, bleep out or whatever it is that we could do. But for the most part, that is why we are reading it into the record.
And keep in mind too that the order requires the public to have the opportunity to observe the meeting. So part of that would be the public who isn't commenting the opportunity to hear the public comments. So I think even though you can still put rules on time limit, or if you want to do it by word count or however you do it, you can put rules on it, but I think the public observing gets the opportunity to hear those comments.
Great, thank you both, and I apologize if we did not get to your question. Going to give you a few ways to connect with us after this webinar. Definitely encourage you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter, stay up to date with any upcoming trainings we're having or any information we're putting out on this front. And then here is all of our contact information, so please feel free to follow up with us separately if we didn't get to your question or if you have any additional questions or comments. With that, I will turn it back to Mike and Randy for any final comments.
I'll just say thank you and keep doing what you're doing as good public servants.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
All right, thank you, Randy and Mike and everybody on the line. I hope you have a great rest of your day.